Alright, so in the previous video, what we talked about was the monetary policy and the three tools of monetary policy, right? So, quick review on that. We had discount rate. We had, I like the marker better. We had reserve requirement. And we had open market operations. Okay, now I'm going to talk about these here in relation to a few graphs. This is something that I mentioned in the quick note in the module, is that this isn't really how it works anymore. And we'll get into this in the next video. But AP is not caught up to how things actually work now. So I'm kind of in the weird position of, I can teach you I can teach to the test, or I can teach you the truth, and I can't really do both at the same time. So what I'm talking about now is what you need to know for the test in order to be able to score points on the test. However, this is not how monetary policy currently works any longer. The Fed doesn't do this stuff anymore, not like it used to. And in the next video, I'll talk about why that is and how this now operates. But I want to go over, at least for the purposes of the test, how things used to operate. All right, so I'm teaching you. I don't know. You can look at this as being historical monetary policy, because that's really what this is. But we need to know a couple of graphs here. Now, we know our good old tried and true graph of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Alright, so, oops, come back. Come back. So, the one that looks like this, our GDP, price level, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply. The aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, the king graph. Everything winds up coming back to this somehow. Alright, now for monetary policy, we have a new graph that we have to deal with. And it looks like this. Okay, this is the money market graph. Okay, this is the money market graph. So this is a supply and demand graph, and what is the supply and demand of is money in the economy. Okay, now the x-axis here is the quantity of money in circulation. How much money is out there in circulation? So Q sub M is quantity of money. The y-axis here is the nominal interest rate. So this is the interest rate you would get if you were to borrow money or if you were to save money, right? So this is the interest rate you actually see. Remember that nominal differs from real. Nominal is what you see, and talk about the number of dollars you get or have to pay. Whereas real interest rate is talking about how much real value you have to pay or that you get for saving. Okay, so real interest rate is after we take into account the whole inflation aspect, right? So the real is going to be the nominal rate minus the rate of inflation. Okay, so the nominal interest rate, again, the headline, right? So this is what we got right here is nominal rate. The demand for money is what this MD curve is, right? Money demand. And money demand is downward sloping because when interest rates are lower, there's a bigger demand for money within the economy. So lower interest rates means a bigger quantity of money needed within the economy to be able to operate. Because when interest rates are lower, what do people want to do? Well, they are less likely to save their money, and they're more likely to spend it, which means the economy needs more money to be able to operate. Okay? And when interest rates are higher, people are more likely to save money, and therefore less likely to spend it, which means the economy doesn't need as much money to be able to operate. Okay, so this is why you see that inverse relationship here. Really, that nominal interest rate is the price of money, if you think about it. It's about opportunity cost, right? So if I spend my money, the opportunity cost is the money that I gave up I could have gotten by saving it. So inverse relationship here between the interest rates and the quantity of money that's going to be in circulation. The money supply curve is a vertical line. The reason it's a vertical line is because the Federal Reserve determines how much money is going to be out there, right? And they will do it irrespective of whatever interest rates are. In fact, they will manipulate the money supply in order to influence the interest rates, okay? So this is the setup we got right here. Let's say the Fed is engaging in expansionary monetary policy. All right, so it's going to enlarge the money supply through one of those three classic actions, right, where it's going to lower the discount rate, it will lower reserve requirements, or it will buy bonds in open market operations. Any way we do it, the result is that we get, we get a new supply curve. So supply shifts to the right. And what happens? Well, we look at the interest rates. That's where they were. This is where they are now. So our interest rates went from there to there, right? They went down. So we have lower nominal interest rates. That's a terrible arrow, isn't it? All right, so interest rates have gone down, and at lower interest rates, people are more likely to spend, less likely to save. So consumption will go up. At the same time, business investment will increase also. Businesses will invest more in capital because it's less in their interest to save their money and more likely to be in their interest to spend it in the form of investing in capital. It's also easier for businesses and consumers to be able to borrow money, and when they borrow the money, therefore, they're going to spend it instead. All right? So lower nominal interest rates leads to greater amounts of consumption and greater amounts of investment. All right, investment, remember that applies to businesses investing in capital, not people. People save. Okay? So that's what we wind up having. And conversely, let's say we were going to do contractionary monetary policy. So we draw our graph again, quantity of money, nominal interest rate, downward sloping money demand, vertical money supply curve. Let's say we're going to do contractionary monetary policy. We will contract the money supply, lessen the amount of money in circulation, which means a lower money supply. So the money supply curve will shift to the left, and it would do this through one of the three tools again, or a combination thereof, right? So it would raise the discount rate, so it's more expensive for banks to borrow from the Fed. Raise the reserve requirement, so therefore banks have to keep more money on hand. It can't loan out as much. If they don't loan out as much, they won't create as much. Or the Fed will sell bonds in open market operations. And when it sells bonds, it sells it to the banks, let's say, and the Fed buys those bonds with, let me reverse. Fed sells the bonds to the banks in return for money. The Fed gets the money, takes that money out of circulation, the money ceases to exist, right? End result is what we wind up having is interest rates started here, and then they went up here. Right? Lower money supply means higher interest rates, and higher interest rates means that consumption goes down because people are now more likely to save their money instead of spend it. Investment decreases as well. Businesses will be more likely to save their money instead of investing it in factories because they get a bigger return by saving it instead of investing it in whatever capital. And it's more difficult for both parties to be able to borrow money. All right? It's more expensive, so they will hold on to it instead. Instead of borrowing money and therefore spending it, they don't borrow money, therefore they don't spend it, and so consumption, investment goes down, and aggregate demand will decrease, which is the goal of contractionary monetary policy. Okay, so that's the general idea here with this graph, right? So if we were to connect them, let us say that we are in recession. So let's look at the king graph. We'll draw that. Somebody is at my door. I'm going to ignore them for the moment. So we got our situation like this. Short aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and here is LRAS. Okay. Now, anytime you see the intersection of AD and SRAS to the left of LRAS, what that indicates is that we are currently in a recession. Okay, full employment output is what we're capable of doing when we are operating at full employment. There's no recession, there's no cyclical unemployment. This is going to be when the economy is operating on all cylinders, right? So this is where things you want to be, right? Sometimes this is called potential output, where we could potentially be. Anytime the intersection is over here, right, this intersection between SRAS and aggregate demand shows where we currently are. So anytime it's to the left of LRAS, to the left of full employment, what that indicates is that we are producing beneath our full employment capacity, right? Typically that means that we are in a recession, okay? So this intersection to the left means we are currently in a recession. So let's say this is where we are at the moment. Okay, in a recession. It's supposed to be a Y. Make that a little better. All right. Now, what do we want to do? Well, we don't want it to be there. If we're going to do expansionary policy, either fiscal policy or monetary policy, the goal is get more spending, right? So if aggregate demand is equal to C plus IG plus G plus XN, all right, policy looks at this as being a spending problem. People aren't spending enough. We need people to spend more. All right, so we can do that through expansionary fiscal policy, or we can do it through expansionary monetary policy. If we're doing expansionary fiscal policy, remember the government will spend more and or tax less. If we're doing expansionary monetary policy, we're going to do this, right? So we'll do one of our three tools of monetary policy: discount rate, reserve requirement, open market operations, all right? And through that, we will raise the money supply, yeah? And money supply shifts to the right, interest rates fall. And when we do that, we get higher consumption, higher investment, which means aggregate demand will increase, and shift to the right. And we'll get back to long-run equilibrium, assuming that I actually intersected there like I was supposed to. So price levels went up a little bit more, but we're back at full employment output, right? So that would be if we're doing expansionary monetary policy, which we would do during a recession. Yeah. And then if we're in an inflationary period, oops, actually, hold on, let me reverse this a little bit. Bother. And just delete that guy. There we are. Okay, inflationary period is going to be anytime you see the intersection of SRAS and aggregate demand to the right of LRAS. So typically this occurs because aggregate demand is shifting too far beyond full employment output. So too much money chasing too few goods. People are trying to buy. There's not enough stuff to be bought because we're already past full employment output right there. We don't have enough workers and material and everything to be able to produce at the level that would be necessary right here. All right. So in this case, we would use contractionary policy. Contractionary fiscal policy, lower government spending and raise taxes, or we can use contractionary monetary policy, which would be represented by this graph, right? So we can raise the discount rate, raise the reserve requirement, or sell bonds on the open market, all right? So the result would be money supply decreases, shifts to the left, interest rates rise. What happens then? RC plus IG plus G plus XN. Consumption goes down, investment goes down, therefore aggregate demand goes down. It would shift to the left. We get ourselves a new aggregate demand curve to the left, right? Shift left. So, end result, price levels decrease from where they were before. So this is where they started off. This is where they are now. And we see the output fell as well. Went back to full employment output. All right. So now this is the connection here between these two graphs. One more graph, which I got to throw at you, is showing the mechanism that's involved here. Okay. So what the Fed is trying to control, it's called the federal funds rate. Okay. The discount rate is the interest rate at which banks borrow from the Fed in order to meet reserve requirements and whatnot. However, banks don't want to borrow money from the Fed. It's typically more expensive, plus it looks bad if you're borrowing from the Fed. The Fed is the lender of last resort. Okay, what they typically want to do is borrow from other banks at what's called the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is the interest rate at which banks borrow money from other banks. Right? Sometimes this is just known as Fed funds. Okay, or FFR, right? Federal funds rate. Okay, interest rate at which banks borrow from other banks. They borrow money overnight and then pay it back the next morning, right? In order to meet reserve requirements or for whatever purpose. Okay, now how that works out, why it is that open market operations, especially in adjusting the money supply here, can affect interest rates is because of loanable funds market. Okay, this is the loanable funds graph. Let me get rid of that. Okay, and think of loanable funds as really kind of what it is, right? So it's the demand for loanable funds and the supply of loanable funds. Just a supply and demand graph. Okay, so the quantity of loanable funds is how much money is out there to be loaned, all right? And where does the money come from? Well, really, right? The supply of loanable funds is roughly equivalent to savings. I don't want to say it is exactly the same, right? But when you deposit money into a bank, what does the bank do with that money you've deposited? It loans it out. That's how the bank makes money. It loans money out at interest. Okay, so you are supplying loanable funds within the banking system. Okay, the demand for loanable funds is borrowing. Okay, so people who are demanding loanable funds within the banking system are the people who want to be able to borrow money. All right, so the quantity of loanable funds is the x-axis, and the y-axis here is real interest rate. Again, not nominal, but real. Yeah, that's important, real. So lowercase r is what that guy is. All right, now, the supply of loanable funds, it's mostly savings, and the reason I point this out is because sometimes there's questions where it says, people have increased savings, what happens to the real interest rates? Well, if you know that savings is the supply of loanable funds, you can be able to answer that, right? But savings can also wind up being the Fed, right? So if the Fed is buying bonds, let's say we're doing expansionary monetary policy. The Fed is buying bonds on the open market. It could buy it directly from banks, and if it buys it directly from banks, all the money becomes instantaneously excess reserves that's available to be loaned out. It can also be that if it's buying it from private individuals, well, the people will save some of that money, right? So therefore, you'll see increased savings in the economy because of the Fed's expansionary policy, right? It's buying bonds in open market operations. And so increased savings means that the supply of loanable funds will shift to the right. Okay, so you're a bank, there's a bigger amount of savings in your bank. More money has been deposited than what you had before. If interest rates are right here, this is where they started off. Well, you're a bank, the supply of loanable funds has increased and shifted to right, and now it's over here. You now have excess money, right? Surplus money sitting around, not getting borrowed. You want people to borrow that money because you want to make a profit. How are you going to get them to borrow it? You lower the price, just like what you would do on the surplus of any product if you were a retailer. All right, you got a surplus, you lower the price in order to convince people to buy it. If you're a bank, you have a surplus of loanable funds, money to be loaned out. How do you get people to buy it in the form of borrowing it? You lower the price. In this case, you lower the interest rate. Oops, wrong one. So interest rates go down as a result. And so this is what lowers interest rates within the economy. And it lowers the federal funds rate also, the rate at which banks borrow from each other, because surplus of loanable funds to be able to loan to other banks as well. So federal funds rate goes down, all interest rates wind up going down. Okay. So what we see here would be consistent with expansionary monetary policy. Okay, this would be consistent with expansionary monetary policy. This is a mechanism by which open market operations, buying bonds, will lower interest rates. All right, and why you see this action in the money market. Right, this is why when we increase the money supply, that interest rates fall the way they do, is because it increases loanable funds, supply of loanable funds within the economy, so we see everything go down. Good. There we go. Okay. Now, let's say that the Fed is doing contractionary monetary policy. So we have quantity of money again, real interest rate, demand for loanable funds, supply of loanable funds. All right. In this case, the Fed is going to take money out of the economy. All right. So let's say it sells bonds. Well, what'll happen then? There's less money out there, which means that less money is going to get saved. So the supply of loanable funds will shift to the left. So interest rates were right there. Now they're here. Interest rates went up. Why did they go up? Well, oh, excuse me. That's not money. That should have been loanable funds. My mistake. Yep. So why is it that interest rates went up the way they did? Well, if there's less money being saved, that means that the supply of loanable funds is going to decrease. There's not as much loanable funds in the economy as what there was before. Basically, there's now a shortage of loanable funds within the banking system. Okay? So just like the price for anything, if there's a shortage of that product, what will retailers do? They start to raise the price. And this is what banks will do to their interest rates. If there is a shortage of loanable funds to be loaned out, they realize they can start loaning that money at a premium. And so they boost interest rates, right? They raise the price of their loans. So as they raise the price of their loans, people will be less likely to borrow, etc. All right. So you see interest rates go up, whether it be for mortgages or car loans. You see the federal funds rate go up, especially, right? Banks will charge more to loan to other banks. So at the FFR, the federal funds rate, the rate at which banks loan money to other banks will increase. Okay, so interest rates rise in the loanable funds market, and so this is why you see, there it was. This is why you see, this effect. Right? You see interest rates rise, right, when the money supply decreases. Right, as the money supply decreases, you see a lower supply of loanable funds, so those interest rates go up. All right, so this is the connection here between our monetary policy, all right, and loanable funds, money market, and our king graph, right? So it's all interconnected. So when the Federal Reserve takes policy action, right, monetary policy, expansionary or contractionary, it affects things within the money market, which is what we see here, right? And the reason it affects things in the money market is because of what happens in the loanable funds market, okay, and how it affects interest rates. Okay, and so what happens in interest rates will also affect what we see in the king graph, right? How it'll affect spending decisions. So its monetary policy action will affect interest rates, which therefore affects spending, right? Lower interest rates means more spending. Aggregate demand will shift to the right. Higher interest rates means less spending, and aggregate demand will shift to the left. All right. So this is the interconnection between all this stuff. All right.